Good evening, everyone. I'm Claire Delmar, and on behalf of the Listen to Locals campaign, I'd like to welcome you to this local community hustings, set up to give candidates for Mayor of London an opportunity to hear from local community groups about their experiences and aspirations with regard to planning. I'd like to thank my colleagues at Just Space and Collective Community Action for partnering with Listen to Locals to organize this event. Thank you also to the 4 candidates and deputies for being here, representing the Conservative, Green, Liberal Democrat, and Women's Equality parties. The Labour Party candidate did not respond to our invitation. Thank you to the 7 community groups who are here to express concerns on behalf of their local communities. And thank you to Ross Lytle from the Evening Standard for joining us as moderator. All of your participation is especially appreciated given the rescheduling of this event. We have a program based on 7 topics with a local community group presenting statements and questions to the candidates on each topic. This program is posted in the group chat. There's also a Q&A space where you can post questions throughout, and depending on time at the end, we'll attempt to raise them with the candidates. In any case, we'll collect all questions and ensure they get to the candidates afterward. Finally, this event will be recorded and uploaded onto the Listen to Locals website and to YouTube afterwards. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ross Lytle. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have just under 90 minutes now for tonight's debate. We have 4 excellent candidates, 2 of the mayoral candidates, 2 of the leading candidates. And we have, as Claire says, 7 main subjects. What we'd like to do first is allow each of the candidates to make an opening statement, and then we'll go to a speaker on each of the subjects who will then introduce their subject and invite the candidates to respond. Just a request at the start for each of the candidates to be brief if they could. That will allow us time for any extra questions that come in the chat box or Q&A box as we're progressing through this evening. We hope to cover a wide range of things that are obviously of great concern to, if you like, Londoners, the sort of grassroots concerns, whether it's sort of planning, housing and so on, in particular community-led initiatives. And of course, one of our old favourites, the Silvertown Tunnel, which seems to certainly been one of the main issues of this mayoral campaign. We now, as many people know, we have 8 days left in the race. It's certainly getting tighter according to the most recent polls. So let's hear what the candidates have to say. What I shall do is invite the candidates to speak according to the list I have, which is on an alphabetical basis, if everybody's happy with that. And first introduce the 4 candidates we have tonight. We have Shan Berry, who is the Green mayoral candidate. We have Neil Garrett, who is standing in for Sean Bailey, the Tory candidate. And Neil as well is the candidate for Croydon and Sutton on the London Assembly. We have Tabitha Morton, who is deputising for Mandu Reid, the Women's Equality Party candidate. And Tabitha is the deputy leader of the Women's Equality Party and also an Assembly candidate. And we have Louisa Porritt, who is the Lib Dem mayoral candidate. So thank you all very much for taking part. The one person we don't have, sadly, is Sadiq Khan, but I do have a friend who Shan and Louisa may recognise. Now, this is not Sadiq, it is red, but my little friend here, my Mr. Man, Mr. Strong, will pop up occasionally if the candidates go on for a little bit too long. So beware, if you see Mr. Strong, please bring your remarks to a close. So let's get going. Over to Shan, a couple of minutes if you'd like to sort of set out your opening pitch, please, Shan. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I would not have missed this event. I think the work that is done by the community groups represented here and so many like you across the city is so valuable, and it's really important that politicians listen to you and get feedback, and I think this event will be very much a two-way event. Now, in this election, I'm putting forwards plans for a genuine transformation for London. My plans before the pandemic, in the election that was cancelled this time last year, were very much about transforming London. But in the context of the pandemic, after the year we've had, I think Londoners are crying out for something that genuinely represents a new start. And my campaign, I think, is the only one that does that. We are talking about a recovery that raises everyone up and brings everyone together to plan a secure future for London. And I think that's something the groups here today are really, really should be part of. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the principles of bottom-up leadership and where power lies, because these are things that I really care about. These are very strong green values. They're part of green principles, but they're what attracted me to the Green Party in large part as well. It's how the Green Party runs itself in a very bottom-up way. I'm the co-leader of the Green Party, not the leader of the Green Party. And so I came into City Hall as an Assembly member 5 years ago, very much on a platform of wanting to work more closely with grassroots groups and fix some of those levers about where power lies within how London is governed. And I did work with groups here, with groups in housing, and particularly to make some changes, things like winning ballots for estate residents. And some people in the commentariat get very confused that the reason we wanted ballots is so that residents can just keep saying no to things. No. The reason you want a ballot at the end of the process is so that the process is more resident-led from the start, so that better plans come forwards, co-produced with residents, and so that they then sail through the approval at the end. It isn't just about saying no, it's about changing how things are done. Now, in my manifesto, you'll see there's ways I've put in place to improve the gains we made under the current mayor and make that whole process of developing new housing in London much more collaborative and co-produced in much deeper ways. But I think that is genuinely a start and something we helped win together, a big U-turn from the current mayor. Now, there's a lot of things in my manifesto that I really hope you should look at. There's a page literally called Bottom Up Leadership. There's a page all about how we need to remake the London plan from scratch, working with people and having that important statement of community involvement that I know the groups here are very much after. There's also a really excellent policy about having a People's Land Commission. And for me, that's how we should plan London. Each local area empowered and resourced so that every local area has this, not just the ones who are organising for themselves, so that they get organised and they look at the land that they have, how it's being used, think about what they want to preserve, and what they want to change and what their community genuinely needs. And then once those plans are made, once we have People's Land Commissions in different areas reporting, then we can start to put things behind that from City Hall. And that, I think, is something that would genuinely revolutionise things. But in the 5 years since I've been an Assembly member, although I have these principles and we've done some work together, I know what I have done also is learn an awful lot about what this genuinely means in practice, how sometimes answers that seem simple, oh yes, we'll just do this and just do this, they're not right in practice, and how you have to have that iterative process of trying things, working with what's on the ground and working with people from different groups who represent the community to change things later. It's all about learning together, I think, and that's something that I hope we'll talk about later on. But yes, I think genuinely we need a Green Mayor to be the one who brings those principles to bear in City Hall, who genuinely shares their power with Londoners. And I think you'll only really get a green recovery, you'll only get the greenest city in the world if you elect a Green Mayor and put a green vote first in this election, and also get some more Assembly members into City Hall so that whoever is the mayor, we've got a group of people working with you and with those principles, pushing whoever is the current mayor, whoever is the mayor to do better.
Okay, Shan,
We've
thank
got
you
3
very
minutes.
much.
That was probably a bit long, sorry.
I didn't want to bring Mr. Strong out too early, but I may keep a tally to see how often he pops up and see who gets most brings him out most frequently and let you know at the end. But let's go straight to Neil now. So Neil, you're going to speak on behalf of Sean, but I guess also of yourself. You hope to make it to City Hall 2 on the Assembly. What's your opening remarks, please?
Thank you very much. Yes, you've probably noticed I'm not Sean Bailey. I hope I can say something about what he would have been able to say had he been here this evening. I'd like to start just by saying thank you to everyone who's organised this and who's put so much work into the questions and the topics that we have this evening. I know they are things that are very important to a lot of Londoners. So I'm the London Assembly candidate for the Conservatives for Croydon and Sutton. I'm also a councillor in Sutton, which is how I've actually had already quite a bit of experience with many of these planning related issues, which of course end up very often on the doorstep of councils rather than City Hall. thinking about some of the issues that are in the questions this evening, I think back to when I listened to Roger Scruton speak some time ago. He was heavily involved in the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and he pointed out that when you see a place and it has beauty in it, what that is a sign of the love of the people who live in that place that they have for it. And I think it's a sign that it's cared about enough for the people to take the time and the care to make it beautiful. And I think what all the groups have in common this evening is the love that they have for the place that exists and the places that hopefully will exist in future, and their willingness to take the time to look after it. One of the things that comes up, I think, time and again that I see in planning issues and in many of the questions we have, I think the issues for this evening are about getting people, local people, involved early in the process so that it doesn't just suddenly arrive on a council's doorstep as a planning application, as a fait accompli that has to be voted for or against. Some of the worst applications end up that way. And you can see that with some changes to the plan, it could have been a much better development for everyone, but a planning committee is left having to decide for or against, rejecting or accepting in whole, which is a really sad end, I think, sometimes for applications. But I think the other point that I would make is the impact that the lack of housing and the affordability of housing in London has, particularly on younger people. And certainly as a Conservative, I worry a lot about formation of families and the pressures on families from housing stress and overcrowding. And I do worry that the breakdown of that natural cycle of forming families and family life and settling down and starting a family is under real pressure, particularly in London. I think housing is one of the biggest threats to that. And so that's why I think Sean's promises about 100,000 homes for £100,000 on shared ownership, which is how he got his start on the property ladder, I think are very important policies, and particularly about creating homeowners rather than landlords, which I think is what the Labour mayor is more interested in. And so while I think it's important that we get the right kind of development, I think it's important that that doesn't just become a reason not to build anything, because housing and overcrowding are serious challenges facing Londoners. And conscious of the clock, particularly young Londoners, conscious of the clock, I look forward to talking about some of the more detail on those issues this evening, because I think they really make a big impact on people's lives now and for a very long time into the future.
Okay, Neil, thank you very much for your opening remarks. It is now the turn of Tabitha Morton, who, like Neil, is also bidding to get onto the London Assembly, and she is deputising for her party leader, Mandu Reid. Tabitha, could we hear your opening remarks, please?
Thank you. And thank you. I'm really pleased that this event was reorganised. So that's the reason I get to attend tonight. So thank you so much for this. It's such an important conversation to have. Because for too long, infrastructure, housing and our communities, the planning behind that has been a one-size-fits-men approach. And this just does a disservice to all of us in our communities. Our infrastructure is still predicated on a male journey to and from a place of work. It ignores the multiple journeys that women make, looking after children, loved ones, doing multiple shopping. Our housing stock too often is still built thinking of a 2.4 family. What happens to single parents, extended family, and mixed developments? Mixed developments these days seem to be a fancy coffee shop. Well, mixed developments actually should have they should have community hubs in them. They should have health centres, chemists, safe green spaces for us all to mix. And this isn't a new phenomenon. As you can guess, I'm not London born and bred. I was born and bred in Liverpool. And my family moved to a new estate that was built on the suburbs of Liverpool in the 1970s. And there was a bright idea to put 1,200 families into an estate with 2 shops and no bus. And guess what? There was social collapse on that estate. I grew up in a very violent neighbourhood where there was very little respect for property. And as kids, we were brought up to really think there was not much future for us. Moving to London, and when I hear about developments in my area in Hackney, I see not much more thought is actually put in today. And I think we've got a huge opportunity now. The pandemic we've just seen was not gender neutral. Women faced a huge, were hit the hardest because of the types of jobs they did and the amount of caring they did. So if we're going to build back equal, we have to build back equal for everybody. And guess what? That actually makes it better for all. So what are some of the things that we want to do? Again, like all the candidates have already said, I haven't got time to go through our whole manifesto, so I'd love you to look through that. But we want to do some amazing things. We want to make sure that housing is properly affordable. Women spend up to 80% of their incomes on rent in London. We want to invest in social housing. We want to make sure that we ring fence 5% of housing for women fleeing violence and 20% for rough sleepers for women. But we also need to make our streets and our homes safer. We're also living through a pandemic of violence against women and girls. So we would invest in making sure there were specialist services in our communities that were supporting women to escape violence, and also to stop kids growing up in violent families that have a knock-on effect to the street violence and the violence that we see around the city today. We would also make sure that we invested in 2,000 refuge spaces for women across London, and these would be run by and for the women in the communities that they serve. And that means that they would be run by Black women for Black women, LGBTQI people for LGBTQI people. So our communities and our services were really meshed together. So my message is, it's time to end this one size fits men. I'm looking forward to delving into all of the brilliant questions that have been posed to us tonight to really talk about how the Women's Equality Party cares about communities, but cares about building back equal.
Okay, thank you very much, Tabitha. You've given me pause for thought. I'm thinking I should rename Mr. Strong, Ms. Strong for tonight, at least part of it. Anyway, let's go over to Louisa now for your opening statement. Louisa Porritt, the Lib Dem mayoral candidate.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you to the organisations represented here tonight. Liberal Democrats believe individuals and communities know best how to live their lives and make their own decisions. We believe in partnership with residents, businesses, the voluntary sector and the state. So I'm delighted to be here with you to discuss how we can take London forward together. From lost lives to lost jobs, the pandemic has hit London hard, but it's also shown the strength and resilience of Londoners and the incredible potential of our communities when we work together to make our city a better place to live. That's the potential I want to build on as mayor. The pandemic has accelerated big changes in our capital, from the rise of online shopping to the shift to home working. We need a plan to embrace those changes and get our city ready for the future. The Liberal Democrat plan focuses on 3 basic needs of Londoners: jobs, homes and clean air. On jobs, this starts with London's 600 neighbourhoods and their communities. We can reinvent our high streets for the future by supporting small businesses and providing more of the services local people want, like childcare, shared working spaces and police stations. A decent home should be a human right. The current mayor has failed to deliver even half of his own affordable homes target, and it's notable he isn't here tonight to account for that poor record. I'll set up the London Housing Company, a City Hall-backed developer, to take control of delivering the homes Londoners need directly, working with communities so that developments are done with them, not to them. There will be more empty office space in the centre of London. I'll convert that empty office space into high quality, affordable homes for Londoners, breathing new life back into our neighbourhoods at the same time. They've done it in Rotterdam, so we can do it here too. We need to address toxic air pollution in our city. This is a silent killer for which there is no vaccine. As mayor, I'd invest in clean, green public transport to make it easier for Londoners to get around our city in a healthy way. And I'd stop polluting projects like the £2 billion Silvertown Road Tunnel and airport expansions. To make these big changes and get our city ready for the future, as a local councillor, I know the importance of bringing people along with you when making decisions. The Lib Dems value every individual and community. So as mayor, I'd publish City Hall's first statement of community involvement. This would be a promise to all Londoners that there will be proper community involvement in planning decisions across the capital. My plan to take London forward looks to the future. While our city faces great challenges, there's so much opportunity in front of us too, if we're willing to embrace change. I'm looking forward to discussing how we can work together to make every neighbourhood in our capital a fantastic place to live and work.
Thank you very much, Louisa. That's fantastic. So that brings to an end our opening statements. What we will do now, we'll move on to the topics. We have 7 topics. We have a maximum of 10 minutes per topic. And what I'd like to do once each questioner sort of sets the scene for us is allow a minute or so each to respond. But that would then give us a few more minutes either to take questions or points from the Q&A box. See, we already have Chris Waller has been the first to put a question in the Q&A box, and hopefully there'll be many more, and also give the candidates and speakers a chance to interact with each other, because I think that would make for a much livelier debate. So let's go now to Michael Ball from the Waterloo Community Development Group. Michael.
Hi, this pandemic has been a great leveller. We're all in it together. Remember that from austerity? And like austerity, the pandemic has also exposed vast inequalities. A home with good daylight and access to green space has proved critical to well-being and mental health during the lockdown. This is rocket science. Exposure to sunlight increases release of mood-boosting serotonin. Now, the London plan sounds sunny enough, promising good growth by design, optimising designs which benefit everyone, including protection of the daylight that comes into our homes, except a new London plan draft guidance, small print, proposes cutting the amount of daylight deemed adequate by up to half. How? The existing BRE guidelines for sunlight and daylight have been in place for 30 years. Is there new research that shows we now need less daylight? No. The GLA commissioned a company called Point 2 to draft alternative values. Point 2 are the go-to advisors of daylight for developers. They promise on their website, we add game-changing value when delivering planning permission for our clients, allowing us to overcome major daylight and sunlight issues at planning and justify the use of alternative target values. This isn't good growth by design, it's bad growth by stealth, and it has very real impacts. A current application at Albion Embankment almost snuck through, which would reduce daylight to 400 homes, half the daylight to council flat, where on just one floor, for example, 12 children lived, 3 of whom were severely disabled. Luckily, we got the application called in, and Point 2 defended that application at the public inquiry. This is the future, and it's changed, darkness. Now, we contacted GLA members from all parties, and one of them knew about this proposed change to guidance. Transparency. So my questions to the candidates are, did you know about this? Firstly. Secondly, will you pledge to stop this change to protect such basic standards? And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, will you pledge to stop hiring developer stooges and start talking to real communities, even your only elected GLA members?
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. I think it might be most sensible to put that to Shan first. She is our serving London Assembly member. She's been at City Hall for 5 years, and I would imagine Shan would have the best ability at present to answer whether she's been made aware of these changes that are being made, as you say, to the London plan. Shan, would you like to kick off on this question, please?
Yeah, no, I have. I've received it, and I didn't know until you pointed this out, and you put together the emails that you sent to us. My team have it now, but we can't do anything. We're not allowed to do anything in public during the election period, but we will be objecting, and that is it just needs to be stopped. And on the wider point of the fact that the consultants used were the ones who are routinely asked to try to minimise and maximise for the developers what they can do. That's a really good point. And if you look at my manifesto, and this is from experience during the London Assembly as well, far too often you've got exactly the same consultants being used by councils, by housing associations, and by developers, and they're the only experts in the game. And they've got a bias. They're used to working with the very biggest developers to try to squeeze out the community's concerns, things that are essential now, we know, for well-being, like the space standards for homes, the outdoor spaces, the light, and the loss of trees, trying to justify that and get it through planning committees. There's too much of a revolving door too between local councils and local councillors and these companies as well. What I want to develop within City Hall is truly independent experts. There's plenty of work for them, for working for the GLA, working for the public sector, and for good things. and working for local communities. I want to make sure those experts are available to support local community groups, people making their own plans, people wanting to object to plans. It's absolutely crucial that there's a level playing field of expertise, that experts are not constrained by their other commitments to where they get most of their money from. I don't really believe Chinese walls work all that well. We genuinely need publicly funded independent experts who are able to argue for what is right. There is objective right in all of these things, and too often that is fudged by people who are these experts who are very good at arguing down requirements on developers. So yeah, you'll find there's real money behind this. It's really important in fixing one of the really fundamental problems that we have, that the big developers are really the only game in town, and too many people who I think would rather work in public service doing good work end up working for them. And I think there's a big pool of people we could hire to do this work.
Okay, Louisa, let's come to you now, because some of the points Michael was making there about light and space and so on seem to link directly as well to one of your ideas about reusing office space. You know, would there be concerns that if we do repurpose office space as homes, they might not be fabulous places to live?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Ross, because that's exactly why I would set up a City Hall-backed developer, the London Housing Company, to take charge of delivering the affordable homes that Londoners need and making sure, crucially, that they are high-quality homes, so we can move away from this free-for-all Wild West for developers, because we've seen too often across London that when we leave these matters in their hands alone, we don't get the affordable housing that Londoners need. So that's why I want to set up my own development company to make sure that those are high quality conversions. And there are examples of that being done to look to. The model that I want to base my plan on is one that's been done successfully in Rotterdam, where they managed to do high quality conversions. So that's why we need to take charge of this process. I would also do things like introducing a good developer accreditation scheme to recognise when developers in the private sector are working with local communities and meeting their needs, crucially. So I think that what we need really is better standards, and that can be set from City Hall. Sutton Council, run by the Lib Dems, has its own housing company, Sutton Living. And I went to visit a site that they're building right now last Friday. They're actually delivering more affordable homes than Sadiq Khan's level, which is 35%, whereas they're delivering 43%. By contrast, I was in Alperton in Brent on Saturday and saw too many large buildings, too high for the area, not delivering the affordable housing that people changed radically in the space of a year since I was last there. So that's what we need to move away from, and that's why we need a more direct approach.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's come to Neil. Sutton was mentioned there by Louisa. That's your patch as well there, Neil, although if we believe Louisa, the Lib Dems are doing so well there, you won't have any chance of winning it for the Tories. But what's the reality on the ground there in terms of both your work as a local councillor and what's in the Tory manifesto to ensure quality homes across London? I do recall Boris, when he was mayor, used to rail against what he called as hobbit houses. How do we prevent inappropriate small dwellings springing up?
Yeah, I mean, I actually sat on the committee in Sutton that scrutinises Sutton Living, which is what Louise was just talking about. And I suspect the development is the one at the bottom of my road here. So you should have popped by and said hello. I think it's quite complicated making these things work, because there's quite a contrast, these in-house developers work, because there's a big contrast with Brick by Brick, which is just over in Croydon, which we could probably spend the whole evening on, but it is on the whole, it's not been a roaring success, and it's certainly not popular with the residents. I think rather than sort of delve deeply into Sutton Living, which in fairness is relatively new and has quite a short track record, I think I'll give two examples actually. I think in terms of what Sean wants to do in Outer London, I think it's partly about not having sort of excessive tall buildings, inappropriate tall buildings popping up in places where they just don't fit, and having development that's not just in keeping with what's already there and other kind of places that people like to live in. I'll give you two quick examples from in Croydon and Sutton. One is the former Croydon Airport. I don't know whether everyone knows that Croydon has or had an airport, but you can still visit it if you like. On the former Croydon Airport site, there's an estate called Roundshaw, which was redeveloped from a sort of concrete jungle into what's now almost entirely terraced houses. It's pretty dense development, but it's really quite pleasant. You have streets with houses, people have their own front door, small garden. It's so much nicer place to live and to visit and to spend time in than I think it was before. In fact, when one of our MEPs came round to canvass, he actually queried with me that it was social housing. He thought it was sort of some fancy new upscale development. So I think it's a good example of how you can redevelop in a way that is still quite a high level of density to get the housing that we need, but is much more pleasant for people living there. And another example is Durand Close, which some of you may not have heard of, but if you watch The Bill back in the 80s, 90s, all of their stock shots of sort of gritty London estates were filmed in a bit of Sutton called Durand Close, which has been now largely redeveloped, again, as terraced housing, mostly houses with mid-rise flats. And again, you can see how the same area has been rebuilt in a completely different way, still social housing, but it just feels like so much more of a community. And when you walk around there, it feels like a place that people like to live in. And I think those are two really good examples of how you can take an area where you're trying to build social housing, you're trying to build a pretty high level of density to build the houses that we need, but you can end up with a place that is so much nicer to live in, and that the people in those places are then happy to call home.
Okay, thank you very much. Good bit of a TV history there. Just imagine PC Reg Hollis on patrol in your local area there. Let's come to Tabitha now. And can we also look to Tabitha when you respond to this and to Michael's question? Could you also pick up on the first question in the Q&A box, which is from Chris Waller? And the question there is, how will you attempt to reconcile London's strategic needs for housing and other development with local concerns and aspirations for development sites and neighbourhoods, which seems to sort of tie in with your opening remarks when you were talking about growing up in Liverpool and the need for new developments to have pharmacies, I guess schools, playgrounds, and not just be tower blocks and sort of yuppie flats, as we perhaps called them 10 or 15 years ago. Tabitha, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just still a little bit shocked that Neil was so surprised that social housing could be nice, and that's exactly what social housing should be, isn't it? We shouldn't have a two-tier system in this country where social housing has people have a separate door to those people who can afford the £1 million apartments. But to Michael's point, absolutely, we absolutely support your initiative here. We cannot go back on these standards. We have to improve these standards and go forward. We cannot lose the lighting. But this also, to me, talks to the fact that developments don't think about the people they're serving. This is my opening remarks were about the fact that we don't look at planning through a gendered lens. So we don't think about all of the different people and the different ways that we're accessing. Home during lockdown was horrible for many of us, but it was unsafe for so many women because of the domestic violence that we're living under. So we also don't need to block the light out from their houses as well. So absolutely, the Women's Equality support that. To the point in the question, I think the fact is we can't just build houses, we have to build communities. And one of the things that we, I go back to, I have not got any problems with coffee shops, okay, but I'm going to keep coming back to this, that every developer, they put these lovely hoardings around the developments, and they see these people skipping across, their new development. You don't see wheelchair users, you don't see prams, everyone's normally white on these things. You're not looking at the actual communities because the planning does not involve the local communities. There is a knock everything down and start again. And there's some reasons for that, because there is VAT charged on redevelopment of old properties, and there's not VAT charged on new builds. So one of the things that we would say from the Women's Equality Party, we would bring in a commissioner for property development in London that would bring all of these community organisations together on these big projects, but also would lobby national government as well. because it is about the powers that the mayor has and harnessing the communities. So when planning is done, it's not a fait accompli to the communities. The communities are embedded, not once, not twice, but at every stage of the planning. But then for those big things that stop it, like VAT, we need to lobby central government for those changes as well. So yeah, I think it's just, you can't just have this tick box to community development. You have to have people involved at every stage, and it's not just, I'm going to say this again, one size fits man approach.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm conscious of the clock already, and we've got 6 other big subjects to get through. So let's move on to number 2 now, which is community-led planning alternatives. It's going to be introduced by Josh Bottomley from the Mortlake Brewery Community Group. But Josh, could you also, just for those of us watching who don't have a detailed knowledge of where the Mortlake Brewery plans are at, could you just quickly sort of recount that for the candidates and then get into your main question, please?
I will do, yeah, sure. Thank you. So we're at a planning situation. In fact, I'll give the example, because it's a big scheme that potentially will increase the population of Mortlake by 90%, 90. So it's going to have a huge impact on how existing and new residents live, work, exercise. And we have been at this for 10 years. I mean, the community group's been led for 10 years to try and make sure that any scheme results in an integrated, sustainable and thriving community. And interestingly, actually, unlike many West London communities, and we are a West London community, we're pro-development and we're pro-social housing. But the issue right now is, after all of that time, it's been called in by the GLA, and a scheme which Richmond as a council already said was pushing the boundaries of what's possible is now much bigger. They've got 40% more residential units, up to 3 extra stories in height, and no credible traffic mitigation, even though that's one of the reasons the GLA gave to call it in. And all of those changes made with no community involvement whatsoever. And despite 10 years of involvement by the community, and some experts, some of them retired, some working on giving advice. Interestingly, the scheme actually also contravenes the updated London plan, which explicitly gives the local authority the right to determine what is a tall building and the locations where that can happen. And just as one side, for those who don't know, it's a quite interesting site because it's got the river on one side, a railway line on the other, and the only access road ends in a 5-way junction where the South Circular crosses the A316 before it becomes the M3. So it's an inherently constrained site, and there is no solution for this proposed anyway for this expansion. Actually, my question is quite a practical one as an example. I'm really pleased because I think from many of the candidates we're hearing aspects to support the community, but very tangibly, what message does it send to these community groups if after 10 years of this effort, their input gets so shamelessly bypassed? But secondly, very credibly, if you're elected, what can you actually tangibly do to get a particular plan like this one back in line with the community's ambition, the inherent constraints, and even in our case, the updated London plan?
Okay, thank you. Neil, let's come to you first. You know, with your local council hat on, being involved in planning is probably one of the main jobs left to local councillors these days. What's your take on what Josh is asking there about residents who try and complain but can't get their voices heard or their views taken seriously?
Yeah, well, I think councils would probably say they do quite a lot of social care work as well. It's about 70% of our budget. And actually, if I may, just in response to Tabitha, I suppose what I should have said is I actually grew up on an interwar council housing. What was positive for me was that it was looking something like the place that I grew up, which actually, for all that people think about council estates, that was a pretty positive place to grow up. Mm-hmm. I think what I've seen, I think I mentioned it in my earlier remarks, the frustration that I've seen with some applications that come to council is that when a plan comes to a planning committee, I should say I don't sit on the planning committee, but I've been involved in the strategic planning committee. When a plan comes to the planning committee, it is literally a yes or a no. And you can often see how with some fairly small tweaks, something that is really unacceptable and incredibly annoying to the local neighbours could have been made better, but nobody's had that conversation early on. And I think the trick in this somehow is to get developers to start talking to people, the neighbours, councillors, various other sort of local local groups early on. And I've seen myself how you can get a development that has gone through that path, which is actually not only not opposed, but welcomed, and actually has worked really well. In my own ward, there's a section of my ward that's been relatively recently redeveloped in recent decades, and it's mostly consisting of townhouses, and there's still a bit of disused land, and the local residents there, if any developer were thinking of developing it, and we're going to develop yet more of the identical housing that's already nearby, they would be delighted with that. And if a developer turned up and knocked on some doors and spoke to those people or the local residents association or me as a councillor, that's the answer that they would get. And I think it would actually be an enthusiastic yes to turn a bit of derelict land into something positive. I think the challenge, which is probably where a lot of these things, the rubber meets the road, is how do you get developers who aren't wise to understand that a wiser approach is to talk to people rather than sort of try and squeeze something through? Because inevitably the landowner does have a great deal of sway in what they want to do, and sometimes they just pursue a development that is by the letter in compliance with the borough's plan, and therefore the council often has no opportunity other than to accept it. So in terms of what I would do, obviously if I were an assembly member, I wouldn't have, with that hat on, wouldn't have any planning jurisdiction. I think what I would do, certainly for large developments, is try to get wind of where they're happening, find out who's bringing them forward, and actually have a conversation, for example, about that example with the townhouses, so the developer can understand what kinds of development are likely to be acceptable. Because I think in the end, for all that they have a bad rep, most developers don't go into the business to try and have a massive fight with locals. I think they would just like to develop a site in a way that works for the new people moving in, the existing people nearby, and the community. And I realize that can sound a bit utopian, and I'm not really a utopian sort of person, but I think in actual fact, if you can get people talking quite early on, you can get a plan that is much more acceptable. I can't honestly say about the Mortlake example, I'm not familiar with it, but with the sites I have been familiar with, I've seen how early conversations with local people can result in a better plan and an easier path through planning.
Okay, thank you. Let's come to Tabitha now. How would you look to resolve the bigger dilemma as well here with the knowledge that so many more homes in London are needed, but there has to be care in how they're built and where they're put? What would your solution be?
Well, the fact that you're right, we need a lot more homes, but if we don't build communities, we're just storing up problems for ourselves in years to come. And you know, Neil's already pointed out that the mayor and the assembly only have so many powers, that the local authorities have a lot of powers. And we've also seen local authorities have even started to be paid to change their planning decisions by developers. There's allegedly Barnet and Hounslow are two local authorities that have done that. So we've, you know, and obviously we're looking at austerity in local authorities, but I think from a mayoral perspective and from an assembly perspective, at the moment the mayor's only able to call in planning applications that have a strategic importance, things that are like the number of houses or the proximity to the Thames. And I think we need to add more to that, because we need to think about the communities and the effect on the communities. So we're not thinking about the most marginalised in our societies, how they're affected. That criteria needs to be added in, because that would give the mayor's office and the assembly far more power to scrutinise what local authorities were doing. But also, I think this goes back to what I was saying, that, you know, the soft powers comes with the mayor and the assembly as well. And we have to work, you know, the Women's Equality Party are all about this. We will work with any party across the assembly and across London, because and that's why we want to bring a commissioner for the built environment that actually goes and works with the local authorities to try and change this mindset from developers that it's pound over people all of the time. If you start to actually bring developers on board whose DNA is about, of course, making a profit, I understand that we're in a capital society, but there is all the criteria about the society that they're building, the communities that they're building as well. So yeah, the type of developers need to be challenged, and sort of their criteria, but also the mayor's powers needs to be strengthened as well, because at the moment there's only certain things that they can actually overrule boroughs on, but we have to use our soft powers as well to work across the boroughs. Okay, thank you. Let's come to Shan. Shan, is the Mortlake Brewery, has that been on your agenda? And it sort of springs to my mind that perhaps one of the things we could do in terms of changing the way the mayoralty works and the assembly works would be to
almost involved the London Assembly in being a sort of a super planning committee for London, that it, rather than just the mayor himself or herself, takes the view on that. Would that have any mileage with you?
I think we're just thinking about this in the wrong order, basically. I've said in the business hustings this morning, the question was, what power do you most want as mayor that you don't currently have? And I would like full control over housing, planning and land for London. That's 3 powers really, but it is fundamentally, the planning system is broken. Neil has talked about this. You know, it's a responsive process. You know, somebody comes up with a plan, you've written your plan, there's a set of conditions. Does it meet those conditions? If it does, you've got to say yes, otherwise they'll take it to appeal and it'll cost you a fortune. I've seen that in Camden, where I'm a local councillor. We've got something turned down that wasn't generated through the local community, was breaking all the conditions we thought that had been set. They turned it down, and then it was very, very expensive to lose that battle for the council, and you know, distressing. It was the right decision to take, though. So I think, you know, we do need to have a different planning system, and for London to have more control over it, and for it to be much more generative as opposed to responsive. One thing that the mayor does have powers to change processes. There is a rule now that for where you're planning to knock down social housing, you have to go through the estate regeneration guidance that was written. Now, the mayor's estate regeneration guidance is now something that has to be followed if you're going to do something like that. And it's not right, but it could be right within the powers that we have. Now, I did a diagram when I was responding to the mayor's initial guidance of how this should happen. And this is my diagram. I'm going to show you on my iPad. That's how planning should work. Right. And what it says at the beginning is, you know, the residents in the local area need to be there setting the potential goals for what happens in their area. Residents need to be involved from the start at the goal setting stage. Then the next stage I talk about is residents need to be supported with resources to develop their own plans. You know, these beautiful diagrams that come on these exhibition boards and you're supposed to respond to them in consultations, they're not produced by magic elves, they're just drawings, and communities are perfectly capable of producing master plans of their own for an area, with it, which then developers have to comply with if they don't own the land, or which then, if it's public land, the public authorities are then obliged to follow through and make those plans. This is what we need to be doing. We need to be planning things from the bottom up. The process is important. The process determines the results, and no process that tries to fix what we currently have will really get to the heart of that. So that's what I think we absolutely need, is proper bottom-up planning and a completely different process to genuinely fix this. But like I say, there are things you can do within the current powers, and that is absolutely what I would be able to do. And resources is one of them. I think once a community's built and put together an alternative people's plan for an estate, for a neglected piece of land, it's hard to resist complying with that in some way. It has a big influence, even if you don't get exactly what you want in the end into the current system.
Okay, thank you very much. Louisa, you, like Shan, are a Camden councillor, so you know how the system works too. Do you agree with Shan about the idea of taking this sort of as a bottom-up approach and giving the mayor many more powers to intervene right at the start, to actually be there when the drawings are being put on the drawing board?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree with having a more bottom-up approach. It's completely embedded in our party's ethos, and that's how we run government. Our local councils work in that way. I mentioned the example of Sutton earlier. They have a committee system for making decisions. They don't have cabinet members, very different to the way Labour-run councils work, which are very top-down. But I just also, if I may, want to acknowledge Josh's question about the Mortlake Brewery, because I did visit the site last year. And it's an interesting example because the mayor's trying to compensate for his poor housing record by rushing something through that hasn't been thought through because he's not hit his quota. And I'm pleased that the Lib Dems have pushed the mayor to raise their affordable housing commitments, his affordable housing commitments on that site. But I also acknowledge the pressure that this could place on traffic in the surrounding area due to poor planning. And the Lib Dem councillors in the area have told me that he's not involved the local community as well as he could have. So that's precisely why a Liberal Democrat mayor would be the first to publish a statement of community involvement that promised to Londoners that there will be proper community engagement and participation in planning decisions in the capital. Consultations need to be early, they need to be well publicised, and indeed, we should be welcoming ideas from within the community itself, because there are, I've seen it in my work as a local councillor, lots of good ideas that come from residents, and councils should be working with communities to bring those into fruition. But also that's why I think the City Hall backed developer that I would set up would be a really powerful force in changing the current system and that problem whereby you end up often negotiating from a point of weakness with developers. This would put City Hall on the front foot because it would be a disruptive new player in London's housing market, setting the standards for community involvement and delivery of affordable housing.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on now to Will French from Ealing, so just hopping a couple of boroughs over in West London. His question is in a very similar vein to what we've been discussing already. Will, over to you. Are you with us, Will? Can you hear us? No.
Thank you. I'm better.
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me? There we go.
We can hear you now. Come on.
Now, Ealing's a borough. Each year it sends a high-level delegations to the MIPIM property jamboree in Cannes, and their expenses are paid by developers. Then a few months later, major new schemes are announced and then nodded through the planning system, however strongly the community is objecting to them. And like several other London boroughs, Ealing's also set up its own arm's-length development company, and it's using £400 million borrowing secured against the borough to finance new developments. The development is full of risks and heavily dependent on making good calls about what the planners will allow. With so much at stake, conflicts of interest are bound to arise with the council's role as the planning authority. Now, public trust in the planning system has been plummeting, not just in Ealing, but across the capital. Lack of transparency in the way decisions are made seems a big part of the problem. A 2019 survey by Grosvenor Estates, who are stalwarts of the development industry, found just 2% of the public trust developers involved in large-scale developments to act honestly. Only 7% trust local authorities to make decisions in the best interests of the area. This worries Grosvenor Estates' chief executive. In introducing the study, he writes that the lack of trust in planning is bad for democracy. So my question is this: is public trust in planning major developments something the Mayor of London should be concerned about? If so, what beyond a few fine words should the Mayor do to restore community support for managing the huge changes in our city, changes that are affecting us all? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Will. Louisa, let's start with you. If you became mayor, would you go to MIPIM, and how would you ensure transparency while still delivering, 60, 80 odd thousand homes a year?
Well, that's why the statement of community involvement is so important. And I mean, we've seen this far too often. Council planning officers spend more time with developers than they do with residents. And that's the wrong way round if you're trying to improve an area. And you should be doing that with the residents, the people who know it best. So developers should be expected to undertake far more community engagement before bringing forward their plans to a council planning department. And we need to ensure that far more planning policies and procedures, as I was mentioning in my previous answer, are properly publicised, and applications too. Just an example of this, There are many people in Lewisham who don't know that the council is undertaking its update of the Lewisham local plan because the process is really opaque. And here in Camden, where I'm a councillor, the council is developing a recovery plan for the borough, but Labour councillors are having meetings among themselves rather than involving the wider community. So there are things we can do to address this lack of trust and lack of transparency. One of them is the statement of community involvement. The other is this good developer accreditation scheme. And also what's not come up tonight actually is the cladding and wider fire safety scandal. I've said that as mayor, I wouldn't award contracts to any developers that haven't fixed fire safety issues in their existing housing stock. So it's all about setting standards, and a lot of that can be done from City Hall.
Okay, thank you. Tabitha, do you like the idea of hobnobbing with developers at MIPIM? You know, how would you ensure that views of local people are taken seriously, but without slowing down the whole process?
Well, this goes back to my earlier points. If you're basing everything around GDP and making money, and this is the culture that you breed, and it's very easy to get caught up in sleaze accusations. So absolutely no, I think it's exactly the wrong way to do this. But I think what the mayor has to do, whoever's the next mayor, has to put their own house in order first. Because though planning is in the public domain, the viability reports around big projects are not in the public domain. So we don't get to see the detail that the developers have gone through and how they've engaged with communities and actually what some of the impacts on our communities are going to be. So that's the first thing. The mayor has to put their own house in order, he or whoever they are, before then you start to work with other local authorities. And I don't blame people for having a mistrust in planning, because apart from seeing people swan off to fancy holidays, there's just not enough affordable housing. There's not communities. I've worked with Sister Space, which is one of the only Black African domestic violence services in the whole of London, that was evicted by Hackney Council. I'm meeting another organisation on Friday that are doing a food bank and helping young people connect with technology to do their schoolwork. They also cannot find a space to work out of. So I understand why planning is just not trusted. So first, the mayor has to get his or her house in order, make sure those viability reports are published so we really can scrutinise it. And then this goes back also to the fact that communities cannot be a tick box. They have to be involved at every process of planning. And it's not an afterthought when you come back from your sun-kissed break away with the developers. They have to be embedded in that. And those developers have to have that embedded into their DNA. We should not be giving out contracts to people who are only interested in making money.
Okay, thank you very much. I quite fancied the idea of a sun-kissed break right now, to be honest, but maybe that's not quite the spirit of it. Neil, just back to Will's central point, is the planning process transparent enough, and what would the Tories do if it's not?
Well, since we've been just quickly to talk on this MIPIM sun-kissed trip to Cannes business. I mean, there was actually a delegation from Sutton about 3 years ago, which was funded by developers, and the justification for that was that it was funded by developers and therefore not public money. I will say that locally, as the opposition and everyone really challenged that incredibly vocally, and in their defence, they haven't been back since. Nothing seemed to come of it. So whether you would chalk that up as a success or a failure, I'm not sure. I suppose in terms of specific things to improve transparency and trust, I mean, we spoke a bit earlier about sort of redeveloping estates to make them much nicer places to live, particularly getting away from some of the high-rise tower block living, which, personally, I'm not a fan of, particularly in social housing. I think it can be isolating and actually quite expensive to maintain long term. I think one of Sean's policies that I'm very keen on is this right of return, because I think it's all very nice to show people lovely architects' drawings of what the new estate will look like. But if you're not guaranteed that you'll be able to go back there afterwards and you get shunted off to somewhere else, then it doesn't matter how lovely it looks and how wonderful a place it is. So I think Sean's policy of having a right to return, including for housing association tenants and leaseholders, is pretty important in terms of building trust that this glorious new future that people are talking about will include you and not just some other people living in a place that you used to live in. And housing for London, which I think is a City Hall based developer. Again, I think it potentially gets away from this problem of sleaze and developers and cozy relationships and so on, where you have a City Hall based developer. So Housing for London would be a City Hall based developer working with boroughs to build the housing that we need. And if I may, there was a point that came up earlier that I'd just like to sort of disagree with, really, which it seemed to be talking about centralizing planning in City Hall. I'm not quite sure if that was the idea, but I feel like that would be not a recipe for transparency and trust, because I think for people in London, that would feel much more remote. It would be much harder to go along and either witness or heckle the people making the decision. And I think when you travel around London, the variation from one borough to another is pretty huge. The kind of communities and the types of housing that people want is quite different. And I think you have to respect the fact that the individual councillors and the council leaders elected in those boroughs have actually won a mandate from their local people to represent them and make decisions on their behalf. So I'm quite wary of this idea that City Hall, I know it can sound tempting, but this is the centralising instinct that we have a lot of, I think, too much in our country, where someone at a higher level is sort of encouraged to swoop in and take over powers from further down the food chain. And in actual fact, some of those people who are working closer to communities are more in touch with what they need. So I'm not keen on the City Hall planning committee idea.
Okay, Shan, what Neil was saying there sort of touches on your desire expressed a few minutes ago to give the mayor more powers on planning. You know, what's your response to that, and what's your own experience of transparency within the system? It sounds like, almost from what you've been saying about looking to rebuild on City Airport, you'd probably have City Airport developers ringing you up enthused with your idea.
Not yet, but we'll wait and see. No, so I mean, I want powers for London, and then the operative chapter in my manifesto called "I Promise to Share My Power" means that the decisions would then be made at the right level. We get this completely right, but we can only get it right if we're not being constantly interfered with by from the top down by government, who is suddenly going, oh, permitted development and extra floors and all kinds of other things. I could do a massive hour-long lecture on my concerns and work around transparency, but also around the conflicts of interest that there are that are completely undealt with at a council level. There's a very long letter I wrote to the Committee on Standards in Public Life, following work I did investigating the links between councillors in London and the property industry. And we looked at, we did a massive FOI, and we looked in 2018, and we looked at the gifts and hospitality that were declared by councillors, and we also looked at the jobs declared by councillors, and we found nearly 50 councillors employed by the property industry, which I think is an issue. But I also found enormous amounts of gifts and hospitality, and the MIPIM trips, the trips to this big property fair, are all part of that. The work we did was reported in The Guardian and resulted in the resignation of the deputy leader of Westminster Council. So that was an outcome. But what we don't have is a proper system, and this is being discussed in relation to David Cameron at the moment, of people who leave office then leaping straight into jobs with people who are developing land over which they very, very recently had control. There is a huge amount of development going on at council level, and in London it's incredibly valuable, and the temptation to do this kind of corruption and this kind of influencing of decision makers is too high. And the kind of rules that apply to MPs and very senior civil servants in Whitehall, where there's a 2-year cooling off period usually imposed by a committee that looks at whether or not they can do jobs after they leave office, that doesn't apply at all to councils. And I wrote to the Committee on Standards in Public Life saying this was needed, because there's just far too many close links between councillors, and this isn't just the property industry though. This applies across anywhere that there are big contracts. If you're talking about big incinerators, big waste contracts, I think there's a real problem with this kind of, I mean, it used to be called sleaze, but it's basically corruption in local government. And I'm not going to name any names and risk being sued, but it definitely exists. It needs more investigation, and we'll not, like with the police, you can't just get your trust back by, if you've lost trust to the extent that is laid out in this question, you don't get your trust back just by having a PR exercise or saying some nice words. You've genuinely got to change your behaviour, and you can't just change your behaviour by saying, well, we're different to the last lot. You need to put in place genuine safeguards and real systems to prevent it in future, to stop it happening at all, so that nobody can do it, because the temptation is just too great. The value of influencing council decisions is too high, and I just see far too much of it.
Okay, thank you very much. We shall move on now before anybody starts to consult their lawyers. We're on to question 4 now, which is on opportunity areas. Now, we've only got about 20 minutes or so left, so if I can ask all the speakers to try and keep your remarks to 1 minute rather than 2 when you reply. And we've got Hazel Flynn here from the Old Kent Road Community Campaign, who's going to talk about opportunity areas. But could I also invite speakers to look at a question or remarks from Aisha John in the Q&A box, who talks about the Old Oak Common and Park Royal development area as well, which of course has got terribly stuck in the mud and nothing really much has happened there. And there's a good point there about developers really not being from the local area and having very little knowledge of what would fit too. But let's go to Hazel first. If you could ask your question as quickly as you can, please, Hazel.
Yes,
thank you.
Yes, of course. So greetings from South East London. So my name's Hazel Flynn and I live on the Old Kent Road in South London, SE16. And I represent the Old Kent Road Community Campaign. The Old Kent Road has been designated an opportunity area by the GLA, and as a result, there are going to be about 20,000 new homes built on and around the Old Kent Road. Most of these homes will be in huge tower blocks, many over 48 stories high. And of the 20,000 new homes, over 13,000 are officially unaffordable for Southwark's existing residents. That's unaffordable. The average salary of our Southwark residents is in the area between 24 to 31 grand a year, and the cost of the housing are now being estimated as £500,000 for a 1 bed, 600 grand for a 2 bed, and up to 750 grand for a 3. We suspect that many of these properties will be marketed to and bought by overseas investors with no interest in our communities or to live and thrive here. As I said, only 5,000 of those properties are for social rent, and the majority of those are small bed sizes, 1 and 2 beds. And at present, there are 14,000 Southwark housing people on the Southwark housing waiting list, with many families needing larger units, larger property units, and they are destined to remain on those lists forever. And we expect that those numbers to increase because of this pandemic. The GLA's own report in 2018 has stated that the proliferation of tall buildings is failing to meet housing need in London, and this is happening on the Old Kent Road. This is all linked to the mothballing of the Bakerloo line extension by TfL, and they have now confirmed the project will not even be considered for at least another 10 to 20 years. Without this critical infrastructure, much of the developments have already given planning permission by London Borough of Southwark are likely to be financially unviable, and we're not even sure they're ever going to be built. But the views and desires and wishes of the local communities are being ignored, and local businesses have suffered and have had to close. The opportunity area is an excuse for a land grab by developers, and where their profits are priority, and this has been enabled by Southwark and the planning department. And forgive me for being a bit low tech, I've just had this graphic sent to me today. That's what it's going to look like on the Old Kent Road. That's what they want to build.
Okay.
It's absolutely appalling.
Okay.
So my question is, from the campaign that we've got here, is how would you as Mayor address this shocking imbalance and increase the number of homes that are genuinely affordable for most Londoners here, rather than the absentee investors and developers?
Okay, Louisa, let's start with you first. Obviously, Southwark used to be a bit of a Lib Dem stronghold, and not that long ago. But what could you do with something like this, such a big scheme as Mayor, that's still a scheme that's already quite far down the tracks as well, Louisa?
Well, Ross, we shouldn't be allowing these situations to happen in the first place. And I'm sorry, Flynn, about your example. There are too many of them just like this across London. It's unacceptable. Labour-run councils like Southwark have disastrous records on creating genuinely affordable homes in their regeneration projects. And instead, have created a situation like what you've been describing of pricing out existing residents and businesses from the area. And you're absolutely right, Flynn, to point out that there aren't enough social homes for rent in London, and that's what Londoners need. Of the mayor's woeful housing record, half of homes he's actually started are shared ownership, so they're not social rents. And that's what we need to be delivering, which is why I would create the London Housing Company to deliver the genuinely affordable homes that Londoners need. This would be a not-for-profit developer, so we don't have to rely on these dodgy deals with developers anymore, where they often renege on their commitments to provide affordable housing and create schemes that are inappropriate for the areas and haven't involved local communities enough.
Okay, thank you. Neil, you've said already that the Tories are not largely in favour of tower blocks now, but could you do much about a scheme like this that's already in motion?
I mean, I'm not familiar with that scheme, unfortunately. As the downside, I suppose, of having a substitute, I'm afraid. But certainly here in the area I'm familiar with, I've seen some pretty, I mean, I don't want this to turn into a sort of let's all attack Labour, but I mean, they haven't turned up, so they can't defend themselves. But certainly in Croydon, there have been some really terrible developments that are brought through by the Labour Council, including one which seems to have now died, but it was essentially a tower block consisting entirely of one-bedroom flats. Right up to a very busy railway line, the Brighton Main Line, the absolute legal minimum distance from it. I mean, it was really a terrible place to live, I can imagine. And certainly, I think I mentioned earlier, certainly for me, and I know for Sean as well, having grown up in a council estate, I think these are quite important issues. I think, you know, people who can't afford to buy in the open market end up having to live in places that are social housing, and what the nature of that housing and what it's like and the kind of place it is to live in, it makes a huge impact on people's lives. You know, people growing up in places as I did, it makes a huge impact, the kind of places that other people have chosen to build. I mean, I think we all agree about the problems of very tall buildings. I think they're unpleasant to live in. I think they're surprisingly expensive over the long term to maintain, and you have this real loss of sense of community. And I think another point which hasn't come up, but I think is quite important, is this the changing of the definition of family homes. And I know particularly, certainly in outer London, it's very surprising to people when Labour talk about the number of family-sized homes they're building. And what they mean by that is a two-bedroom flat. And I think to my mind, I think it's quite a cynical bit of statistical manipulation, so that they can announce X number of family homes built, and that paints a picture in people's mind which is very different from the reality, which is just lots and lots of two-bedroom flats, which I'm afraid I fear is going to lead to a lot of overcrowding families, which we already have a big problem with. I mean, how you unpick a development that's a very long way down the track, that I'm not sure, but I think I would tend to agree with Louisa that what you would really want to do is not start from here and have a mayor that's much more interested in trying to build places that are good places to live in. And I know Sean's plan, for example, for a chief placemaker, which is about creating more vibrant, livable communities, particularly where you have major development, so that you get some engagement early on from City Hall into the kinds of places that you're building, not just numbers on a spreadsheet, but the actual, you know, livable experience in those buildings at the end. I think that could make a very big difference to developments like this and future large developments.
Thank you. Sian, can you offer any help to what Hazel was saying?
I think Hazel spoke incredibly well there and very clearly about the problems that there are with, and this is, I mean, opportunity areas. We've also got housing zones. We've also got them, I mean, the OPDC is a mayoral development corporation area. There's a lot of top-down development that goes on in London, where even as an assembly member trying to get transparency on these, I spent the whole time trying to get up-to-date information on what's going on with housing zone money, and it's really, really hard, because these things are hidden behind walls, put within arm's length organizations, and it's the kind of tricks that councils also do. And this whole thing needs to be fixed. And the opportunity area at 9 Elms is mentioned as well. And we know you've said that with the Bakerloo line extension not happening, these towers aren't even going to be desirable places to live. They're not even going to do what they want, even on their own terms. The same is true at 9 Elms. I came back from Surbiton today, that's where I was, along the line that runs down the back of the 9 Elms, and just looking at it and thinking, there's not a single Londoner going to be living in those towers. That is not what London needs. I've talked about in my campaign using the housing grant money that's sitting idle at the moment. There's 500 million pounds of it to buy about 1,000 of these homes, basically. Just get them into public use, get them rented out to key workers. But that's not the long-term solution. The long-term solution is to dismantle these opaque, top-down ways of developing areas in London, and do it from the bottom up, genuinely involve communities in planning these things, and put what's not already been agreed, put it on hold. Let's think about what we can do instead, because you need a step change now that we're coming out of the pandemic, because people want different and they ought to get it.
Thank you very much. Tabitha, what do you make of what you've heard about Old Kent Road, or if you know the areas better, would you have any ideas what could be done better at 9 Elms, as Sian mentioned, or indeed how on earth we do something useful at Old Oak Common?
Yeah, I don't know how many people on the call have heard of a neighbourhood in Vienna called Aspen. This is an amazing community. Over 30 years, they have gender mainstreamed planning. It was designed by female architects and planners, and it has some of the highest qualities of life in any urban area in the world. So we know, and this is what we would do as the Women's Equality Party, we would use this opportunity to actually consult with communities and actually look at things through a gendered lens. Sadiq Khan keeps talking about jobs, jobs, jobs as we recover from the pandemic. If we don't have childcare spaces and nurseries, we're going to end up back in the 1940s for women, because they're not going to be able to return to work. So when we do this planning, it's not just about homes, which is really important, that are lit, that are safe, that are not just for 2.4 families, that have lifts, that have chemists, that have health centres, but also that have like nurseries and childcare facilities locally as well, and good transport links. So I think what we would do is sort of throw out the rule book that we've been using around planning and really do gender mainstream planning, because if you do that, you make the world better for everybody, not just women.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the brevity of your answer. We're fast running out of time. We've got about 12 minutes now, 3 questions, and one of them Silvertown, and that's not a quick one. So let's get straight on to Simon Donovan, question 5 on the mayoral statement on community involvement. Simon.
Good evening. My name's Simon Donovan, and I'm asking the question on behalf of an informal campaign group of community groups and built environment professionals called Collective Community Action. And we're campaigning for local views to be heard, and action on the planning system, what you've all been talking about. And unfortunately, this is an issue I've been campaigning on since the 1980s. And with some notable exceptions, it's an issue that's not as adequately been addressed. So I live in Rotherhithe, in the flat I was born in. And as I look out my windows, in all directions, you can see tower cranes across London building new flats. Some of these are massive developments. I can name some developments in London which have got more than 8,000 dwellings being built. Anywhere else, you would call that a development on that scale, a new town. Even the GLA itself, which you want to be the leader of, you aspire to be in charge of, has huge sites across London, and TfL has even more, and you would have direct say over them.
What's your question, Simon?
My question is, we are arguing that there should be a standard set for developers. They often have other standards, considerate constructors and so on, but there's nothing for community development. If you agree that there should be a standard or a kite mark or an accreditation, and I think some have already said they would, what do you think should be in it? How would you measure these developers, and how would you make sure they commit to 10, 15 years of keeping their promises?
Thank you. Let's go first to Neil, in terms of, what would be in a City Hall kite mark under a Tory mayor, but can you also answer a question based on a remark you made earlier. We're being asked in the Q&A box, what did you mean when you talked about Sean's right of return? So what kite mark at City Hall and right of return? 60 seconds if you could, please.
I'll see what I can do. Well, the short answer on the right of return is yes, it would be on the same terms. So hopefully that's a quick one. On the main question we're talking about now, I think I'm pretty sympathetic to the concerns. I mean, it's a lot of the things we've spoken about earlier on this evening about the importance of getting people involved early and how that can lead to a much more successful end result and frankly an easier time for the developer as well if we can engage their self-interest. I think there are two specific things I quickly cover that Sean has spoken about this. One is the chief placemaker role in City Hall, which I briefly mentioned earlier. This is someone whose job, particularly on major developments, would be about going in and making sure that developments are actually put together in a way that creates a good place for people to live. Because I think it's obvious that when you have neglected, less attractive areas, you end up also with high levels of crime and antisocial behavior. And, you know, sort of beautiful surroundings, lovely place to live, often wealthy areas should not be exclusively in wealthy areas. So I think the chief placemaker would have an important role in doing that. I think the other one is about community land trusts, which is potentially a way for local people to have to be more in the driving seat with developing plans in their area. And I think there'll be a presumption that the community group would then take a long-term role in the ownership and the stewardship and the management, not necessarily the development, but just in making sure that local people are more in the driving seat of what happens and what gets built.
Okay, thank you very much. Louisa, a lot of what Simon was saying there seems to echo with what you said earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why the statement of community involvement is so important. I mean, the kinds of parameters I'd be looking at are things like making sure that buildings are safe. If developers have a poor record, then I wouldn't work with them as mayor. We know that there are thousands of leaseholders across London still trapped in unsafe homes. So the first thing the mayor can do is ban contracts with those developers. There needs to be criteria for affordability as well, and that needs to actually be met and not something that developers can just row back on. And that's why having a new player disrupting the market is so important, and setting that standard for the private sector as well. But the other thing that I think has really come out from the discussion tonight is the importance of consultation, and that needs to happen throughout the process, not as an add-on. It needs to be from beginning to end, so that local communities are getting the homes and the services that the local community needs. I would also work with local councils to ensure that residents know how much money their councils collected from Section 106 and SIL agreements, for example. Too many Londoners don't. So there needs to be far more openness about this and engagement with the public to make good use of these funds so that they deliver the projects that local communities want and need.
Fantastic, thank you. Tabitha, 60 seconds. Do you like the idea of kite marks or City Hall accreditation? And if so, what would you have to do as a developer to earn one?
Well, I think, Simon, congratulations on keeping that campaign going. It's hard work to keep a campaign going on that long, but it's important. And we'd like to go further than a kite mark or a statement. We would actually use a citizen assembly model to scrutinise the entire 18 billion annual budget that goes through City Hall, because that's when you start to really get community involved in democracy. I'm the deputy leader of a small party and a party of political outsiders, and I know how important it is to give people a voice that are excluded. So I think the citizen assembly model would work for that, because it draws from across the community. And I mentioned earlier, we'd also, we would trial a London version of the Aspen model. So I would also pull from our learnings from that about gender mainstream planning to sort of really build future standards. So first off, we would have a citizens assembly to really sort of dive into the detail and to scrutinise that, but also make sure that we learn from the trials that we do around gender mainstream planning to make sure that we're building more affordable and approachable and better homes and communities.
Okay, thank you. Hey, Shan, would you be up for this building or this development has been approved by Mayor Shan Berry? 60 seconds, please.
Simon, I'm not sure about this. I don't think I want to give tick approval to some developers. What I want to do is set clear rules for everybody to follow through funding and planning policies, and then stimulate an alternative to the big developers. Let's have different developers being created. Let's have more co-ops, let's have more mutuals, let's have more community interest companies, let's have more people able to build who are not the big developers. So I'm not sure I want to go through all the hassle of trying to create a kite mark for big developers. I want to set some rules they have to follow that are legally binding, and that's, if they follow them, then they're not be prosecuted.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's crack on.
As I can.
Question 6. Let's go to Gerlinda Niwas, I believe. Apologies. Degreening of London's neighbourhoods. Gerlinda. Gerlinda, can you hear us? No. If Gerlinda's not there, shall we go to question 7 then?
I'm here.
Oh, you are. Ah, hello. Quick. Okay, ask your question.
Sorry, I dialed in on the phone. But anyway, I'm from Cressingham Gardens. Hopefully you all know about Cressingham Gardens, but it really should be held up as it works on all levels. But obviously today, the Lambeth Council has the salami slice, the estate, and as a consequence, it's getting very nasty. So they fast-tracked a planning application over the Christmas period. So it was literally, Merry Christmas, we want to demolish your home, and please get your comments in by Christmas. But what I want to highlight today is this particular application, which is actually being submitted by a wholly owned development company of the council itself, so a complete conflict of interest. In it, which is merely demolishing 12 homes to replace it with 20, which is apparently, according to the council, critical for the economic recovery of the country. But in this application, they are removing, for example, 3 80 to 90-year-old trees in contravention of its own local plan. The company, with using taxpayers' money, has submitted a tree survey misidentifying an English oak as a Turkish oak. I mean, how can you misidentify an English oak? They're removing a communal green space, which is at the moment open to all residents on the estate, plus the wider community as they walk through the estate to Brockwell Park.
Okay, what's your question, please, Gerlinda?
They've manipulated the urban greening factor calculation by including a relocated bin area into it just to hit the mayor's target of 0.4. Otherwise, they wouldn't hit the greening factor.
Okay, Gerlinda, please ask your question.
We are, as just recently, we've been registered. We are not a tote crossing. So from an environmental aspect, which is the focus of this particular question, it's all wrong on many levels. And the problem we have is this planning application will now set precedent for the whole Cressingham Gardens, which currently is 300 homes. And understand that the council now wants to build 1,000 homes on this site. But what it basically is a privatization of communal green spaces, destruction of existing green areas.
Okay. Gerlinda, please, could you ask your question?
And the original Cressingham Gardens, they kept all the original trees in place. They're literally built around the trees. So often a lot of the blocks have kinks in them. And you know there's a kink because there was a tree there.
Gerlinda, please ask your question.
Rebuild into something which is, I'm sorry, it's a miserable, horrible, ugly building that doesn't even relate anything to the community, and they've done it with no community involvement on top of it.
Okay, can we move
to
answers, please?
So my question today is, in light of absolutely clear breaches of also not just the local plan, but also the London plan, which are occurring in this, what would you do if elected to stop such breaches and clear manipulation of gardens and targets? Because at the moment, the only way we can stop this is we're having to raise now £30,000 from a social housing.
Okay, we need to move to the answer now.
People,
Thank you.
They give you £5 for the fund, and that means a lot to them.
Thank you, Tabitha. On the issue of retaining green spaces, saving trees, and not losing public spaces to developers or big developments, what would you say?
It's just bad planning. It's planning. If you actually look at clever planning and you think about creating communities and spaces where women are safe, where women spend the majority of the time in these green spaces because they're carers, where they're looking after their children, etc. So you can't pit people against green spaces. I don't believe that ever should be done. We should be creating spaces and homes that last for generations, and that is just not acceptable. So we have to make sure that there's better planning. And as I said before, if you gender the planning, you start to think about the people who are using it rather than just pounds and how much you're going to sell units for.
Okay, thank you. Shan, it's very difficult, though, as Gerlinda was saying, when it's the local council that's leading the development. Here in Walthamstow, where I am, the council there ramroded through a big scheme, and the playground for children shrunk, and the library disappeared and was rebuilt as a mini thing. How do you stand up to councils when they themselves are rather breaking the rules?
Yeah, and they get to mark their own homework, and particularly on trees as well. The rules around tree protection orders they make an assumption that if it's a council tree, it's being well looked after. Well, not in this case. So yeah, no, it is a real problem, and I'm slightly worried because I said earlier we won a big victory on getting ballots whenever there's demolition, and there is demolition in Gerlinda's case actually as well. But I think there is possibly a lot of proposals coming through now which are targeting the green space instead of the homes, and this is another example of why we need bottom-up community-led planning, because people doing that would not target their own green space and the mature trees in their area for new developments. And I think this is just another example of why learning from experience, changing everything, not just doing things one bit at a time, is important. And that's why I think you need a green mayor, because I can sit there in City Hall and get whoever's the current mayor to do this and that and the other on certain points, but to rethink everything, you do need someone who's willing to change everything in City Hall and willing to look at things differently, and there's no way this would happen under a green mayor. So okay. Please vote for me. Thank you. You've got 1 minute left.
Neil, would green spaces, trees and playgrounds be safe under a Tory mayor?
Well, I'd like to hope so. I mean, looking at the changes being proposed in Cressingham Gardens, it is the exact opposite of the process I described earlier at the Croydon Airport site, the Roundshaw estate, and the old Bill set that I mentioned. The exact opposite process of taking terraced family houses that people like and turning them into tower blocks, when it's been so successful going the other way here. So it's kind of heartbreaking to see that happen. And I can appreciate why Gerlinda wants to make sure we've all heard about it at length. I think the pandemic has particularly shown the need for the local environment, that sometimes when it's just treated as a bit of a dormitory town, you can slightly not notice how bad it can be. So I think it's important that those immediate green environment around places where people live, I think they're very important. I think I would also point out again the problem of Labour reclassifying 2-bedroom flats as family homes. So in this case, they're demolishing a load of literally family homes, replacing them with lots of flats. And you may well find Labour claiming that on paper they've increased the number of family homes, which is a bit of a sick joke. And so, my concern is that London needs to be not just a sort of city for 20-year-olds in studio flats. We need to keep people here. We need to retain the talent. And I think we need to be, a long-term, socially and economically sustainable city. And that includes having the kinds of places that are nice family homes. And it's just heartbreaking to see Cressingham Gardens and places like it be flattened for flats.
Thank you.
I would.
Thanks for. And Louisa, finally on Cressingham Gardens, what's your response?
Well, you're speaking my language, Gerlinda. I am so frustrated with the number of mature trees that the Labour-run council in my borough is chopping down. And the Lib Dem opposition group on Southwark Council put forward a recent budget amendment calling for the council to put in place a tree protection order for every mature tree in the borough. But I think there's a broader point here as well. It's a myth that only building on the green belt and protected land can deliver more homes in London. And that's why we need to be much more creative about making use of the existing spaces that we have in London in order to deliver housing. Looking at office to home conversions, public land that's available owned by TfL and the NHS, and also bringing empty homes back into use. And that's what the London Housing Company would do, because developers will always push the line that they have to build on our green spaces, as often the land can be relatively cheap or it doesn't pose the same challenges that can exist with some brownfield sites. So also there's a role for councils here, where a development is on protected green space and there's a condition that open space is restored somewhere. It's vital that those planning conditions are actually enforced, and too often councils aren't doing that. As well as protecting our existing green spaces, I've also got a plan to rewild London with more green roofs and walks. So you will actually have more urban greenery, particularly in the centre of London, where it's more urban and people and boroughs where people don't necessarily have access to parks and green spaces.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on there because I know otherwise Shan will want to tell us all about her bee-friendly bus stops too. But let's go to the last question. And what I think we should do, if you're all happy to do this, is just to sort of skip the closing statements at the end. So in your remarks answering Victoria's question on Silvertown, if you could then sort of look to make any other wider remarks you wish to, so at least we don't end up still being talking at 8:30. So let's go straight over to Victoria Rance from the Stop Silvertown Tunnel Coalition, and she has the final question of the night on air quality. Victoria, please.
I'm going to make it briefer than I did, just to help you out with the timing.
Thank you.
So the Silvertown Tunnel is a motorway with dedicated HGV lanes between Greenwich and Newham, which is the most polluted borough in the UK. And incidentally, 100+ trees will be cut down and are being cut down. So will the Silvertown Tunnel make it easier or harder to achieve World Health Organization targets for both particulates and nitrogen dioxide, which is something that the Mayor has pledged to achieve? So if you were Mayor, what would you do about it?
Okay, thank you very much. Let's start with Neil.
Thanks. I think Sean's position, this is a project that obviously is being pursued and advanced by the current Labour Mayor. I don't think Sean is looking to cancel it. I think the issue that he sees is that there's a lack of river crossings in East London and the congested Blackwall Tunnel, which is creating congestion and poor air quality around that area. And I know that TfL are looking at mitigation measures, which we would certainly want to pursue, such as filtration systems and greater use of trees and no tolls for electric vehicles. But I think the Conservative view is that East London does need a river crossing, and not least there's a sense of fairness and equity between investment going into West London and lack of investment going into East London, which I suppose as a South London are a bit of a neutral on that. And I know that as an asthmatic, Sean is very concerned about air quality, and although he's not planning to cancel Labour's Silvertown Tunnel project, I know that what he's looking to do is to look at where emissions are actually being generated and then tackle those at source. So for example, converting the bus fleet over to zero emissions. And currently I think there are only 400 out of over 9,000 London buses that are zero emissions. Getting all of those onto zero emissions, that would be the equivalent of taking 1 million private cars off the road, for the fact that those vehicles are being driven so much more and therefore generating more pollution. Likewise, interest-free loans for black cabs to transition over to the new electric cab. That would also, if that were taken up, that would also be the equivalent of 1 million private cars coming off the road. And I think, that's an example of where you're actually making an improvement on air quality for the emissions that are actually happening. And I suppose if I could sum up, feels to me that London is sort of on the starting blocks. The vaccine program, hopefully, which is going very well, is getting London sort of ready to open back up. And fortunately, we avoided obviously the EU program, which would have left us in the slow lane. My concern is that London, particularly compared with other cities, is really a footfall city. So many people are traveling around London on foot, and the centre in particular requires people to be there. And the Centre for Cities that's been tracking footfall, even for the last 6 months, even before the latest lockdown, London was in the bottom 5 cities in the UK for footfall. And I think that's a serious problem on top of the housing problems we've spoken about in terms of getting London back up and running, economy and jobs and so on. I think what we need is a can-do mayor who's focused on opening London back up, with getting the London economy moving, and with 8,000 extra police to tackle crime, focus on placemaking and community development that we've talked about tonight. And I just feel that London could be going places, whereas the alternative is Labour, who couldn't even be bothered to turn up. So I feel the contrast is obvious, and the opportunity for London is fantastic with Sean Bailey as mayor.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's ask Tabitha what you think about Silvertown and air quality. And yeah, I'm almost entirely sure that Neil was correct there, that both Sean and Sadiq are in agreement, rarely actually, on both being in favour of the Silvertown tunnel. But what is your party's view on Silvertown and its impact on air quality?
We're not in favour of it at all from an air quality perspective, but also from the fact it's another infrastructure project that promises to deliver wealth and economy and to help the economy. And yet again, every time there's a downturn in the economy, everyone reaches for the hard hats and the sort of the high-vis vests. And we say, actually, if we start to invest in a care-led economy, first off, that's green jobs that you're creating. So I talked earlier about childcare spaces. We would use the Mayor's Good Growth Fund to extend the 30 hours of free childcare to women and men who are in training, to really get people back into work again. We create a care-led revolution from City Hall, really ending the 0-hour contracts that our care workers are working on it across London. And we'd also introduce a wellbeing budget for City Hall, where we measure the success, not just on GDP and economic growth constantly, but the impact on the environment and people across London. Because the air quality has to change, the happiness of the people in London. But this sort of premise that the only way to ever fix an economy is to build things is just not right. Economy, we can build a green economy and a people-led economy. And I'd just like to sum up finally that we would love you to give your orange ballot paper vote to the Women's Equality Party Mayor next. We want to make sure that we hold them to account and make sure that women are not left behind. We can be an important, vital part of rebuilding this fantastic city.
Thank you very much, Tabitha. Louisa, what would you like to say about air quality in Silvertown?
Well, I want to start by thanking Victoria for all the work that you and your fellow campaigners do. It's a scandal that both Labour and the Tories support increasing pollution in our capital by adding more cars with a new road. An expensive £2 billion one at that. And the money being wasted on the Silvertown tunnel should be being spent on improving infrastructure for walking, cycling and public transport, recognising the greener, healthier ways that Londoners want to get about our city. So I would scrap this polluting project on day one, no ifs, no buts. But if I could make some wider comments as well to wrap up, I think the lesson learned from our discussion tonight is that we need to work together with local communities to make sure that every neighbourhood in London is an attractive, affordable and healthy place both to live and to work. And I've got a plan to do just that, responding to the trend of home working by reinventing our high streets so they provide more of the services local communities need. I'll think creatively about the space we already have in London to deliver affordable homes so that we don't have to build on the green belt. But I know that I need to realise this vision with you. The Liberal Democrats believe in empowering local communities and giving people back real power over their own lives, which is why as Mayor, I'd published the first statement of community involvement to put residents at the heart of decision-making processes. We can disrupt the current system of over-reliance on dodgy developer mates of the Tory party by introducing a new City Hall developer. This would work with local communities to ensure we deliver the affordable homes that Londoners need in a way that works for each area, local population and its needs. So if you like the sound of that plan, then vote Liberal Democrat on all 3 ballot papers next Thursday.
Thank you very much, Louisa. And finally, to bring us home, Shan, Silvertown Tunnel air quality and your concluding remarks, please.
So Ross, you've been saying that Labour and the Conservatives are both in favour of it, but actually in these hustings that we've been having, I've heard each of them try to blame the other for it, which sounds a little bit like they don't think it's the best thing in the world. I've had Sadiq Khan saying he inherited it from Boris Johnson, and now we've heard Neil saying this is Sadiq Khan's plan. So I don't think they're as in favour of it as they say. They're just scared to go out and cancel it, and I'm not. I would cancel it on day one. I've been a campaigner against it since 2013, which I think kind of proves that it wasn't Sadiq Khan's idea in the first place, but he isn't cancelling it the way he should. I've had many discussions with him, and he's being very, very stubborn, working with Victoria and her team, who've done a great job at pulling out some of the data and the real costs. The Green Assembly members have exposed the fact that it's going to cost more than £2 billion. This is something that absolutely has to go. It's one of the worst ideas I've ever seen. And from a community perspective, the reason why the predecessor to the Silvertown Tunnel, the Thames Gateway Bridge, eventually got cancelled was because Greens persuaded Ken Livingstone, as part of their budget amendments, to fund experts to work with the those experts then demolished the economic case for the Thames Gateway Bridge, showing that it wouldn't improve the economy of Newham and Tower Hamlets and Greenwich, and in fact would cause more pollution. And it just shows the power of making sure that local communities and objectors to schemes have all the information that they need. And so, yeah, power to you, Victoria. Final comments. We need to build a truly healthy city, a city that is fit for the future, which is a healthy society, which has a healthy environment. We need to change an awful lot about London, and to change everything we do need everybody, and we need to be working with community groups from the bottom up. I hope you've seen tonight that this is truly a principle and a value that the Greens have in our core, and that a Green Mayor and more Green Assembly members would truly listen and empower people in the grassroots like you to change our city, working together with us.
Okay, Shan, thank you very much. Thank you to you, to Louisa, to Neil and Tabitha for answering the questions at such length, and thank you to our questioners. I'm going to have to go because the owner of this little puppet needs to go to bed, so I shall say good night, and I'm going to hand back to Claire to close the meeting. Over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Ross. And I just want to say that I'm absolutely delighted we were able to reschedule for tonight, because clearly we've touched a nerve. Clearly these are topics that people are really wanting to hear about and to talk about. And I hope this is just the beginning of many more of these. So I just want to very quickly thank the candidates and deputies: Sean Berry from the Green Party, Neil Garrett from the Conservatives, standing in for Sean Bailey, Tabitha Morton from the Women's Equality Party, standing in from Andrew Reid, and Louisa Porritt from the Liberal Democrats. Thank you. Thank you to our community leaders: Michael Ball, Josh Bottomley, Will French, Hazel Flynn, Simon Donovan, Gerlinda Nywash, and Victoria Rance. All thank you so much. Obviously he's just turned off, but thank you, Ross, for being such a great moderator. And on behalf of Listen to Locals, Just Space, and Collective Community Action, thank you. To all who've joined this event and asked questions, thank you for your interest and support. And let's please keep this vital conversation going and going strong. That's it for me. Enjoy your evening, everyone. Thanks for joining.